Hi guys, in this video I'm going to talk about post-workout nutrition. However, more specifically we're going to talk about how people talk about this period of time post-workout in isolation without considering the rest of the day's caloric and macronutrient intake and also the pre-exercise meal. Now firstly, this just is completely idiotic just to place this window in isolation, because it completely ignores what an individual has eaten pre-workout and also what they're actually going to be consuming the rest of the day. It's just completely idiotic. So we have to first consider what was actually eaten during the pre-exercise meal, because this can essentially have a significant impact of what actually happens post-workout. So for example, if you have a pre-exercise meal 1 to 2 hours before training, these nutrients are still going to be absorbed during the training bout and then for several hours afterwards. So to put the post-workout meal in isolation when you've still got nutrients being absorbed from the pre-workout meal is just ridiculous. Now we have to first of all put the post-workout nutrition meal into a hierarchy of importance, put it into context. So regardless of what anyone says about the post-workout meal, the hierarchy of importance is still the total calories, macronutrients consumed throughout the whole day. Then we can go further down the hierarchy and look more at frequency, the pre and post workout exercise meal. However, if you're an individual that just solely focuses on what they're eating post workout and completely ignores what they're eating the rest of the day, I suggest you go back to the hierarchy of importance and just get total calories and macronutrients consumed by the end of the day first. Then you can start looking at pre and post workout nutrition. So as we've discussed, there's still going to be nutrients being absorbed from the pre-workout meal, and therefore this will have a significant impact on how much priority we place on that post-workout meal. So for example, timing is now less of an issue, purely because we've got nutrients being absorbed from that pre-workout meal. Added to this, it's important to note the type of training that was performed during the training bout and also when the next training session will be. So let me give you an example. Say we have an endurance trainee who trains twice per day and they perform 2 glycogen depleting sessions during the day. The post-workout nutrition meal, the timing, the type of carbohydrates consumed between session 1 and session 2 is going to be much more important in this context. Conversely, an individual is training once per day who's just doing weight training, not particularly glycogen depleting when you compare it to endurance activity, and their session is 24 hours away and beyond. In the first example, things like speed of glycogen resynthesis is exceptionally important because they need to replenish glycogen before the second training bout, which is very close to the first one, let's say within 8 hours. Conversely, the second person who's just performing weight training, their session is 24 hours away and beyond. Speed of glycogen resynthesis is less of an importance because by consuming sufficient carbohydrates by the end of the day, glycogen resynthesis will take care of itself by default before the following session, which is the next day. So it's important to put this into context. So just to clarify what I've said so far, it's important to consider the hierarchy of importance first, so total calories, macronutrients. Then we look at the pre-exercise meal, then we look at the type of training, when the next training bout is going to be. These all affect the post-workout nutrition meal. It's also important to address the factor of insulin. So you've probably heard the quote online around bodybuilding circles, you need to spike insulin post-workout. However, going back to this pre-exercise meal that's consumed 1 to 2 hours prior to training, if this is containing at least protein and carbohydrates, which it probably will be, insulin levels will be above fasting levels during the training bout and for several hours after training. So by default, this therefore means insulin's already elevated, there's no need to elevate it anymore. Added to this, if you're consuming protein post-workout, protein is actually very insulinogenic. It's not just carbohydrate. So it's another consideration to think about, do I need to be quote-unquote spiking my insulin with high glycemic carbohydrates? Now, other things to consider: dietary fat intake. So you've probably also heard people suggest not consuming dietary fat intake post-workout. However, again, this completely ignores context. let's just go back to firstly looking at the type of training when the next training session will be. So the main point that people make when they say avoid dietary fat in your post-workout meal, they're essentially saying it slows absorption, slows really gastric emptying. However, this is only going to be important for an individual with another session very close to that first session. Therefore, if you're an individual training twice a day, probably would be a good idea to minimise dietary fat intake between session 1 and session 2. Conversely, if you're performing weight training, your next session is over 24 hours away, having some dietary fat in your post-workout meal, it doesn't really matter the speed of absorption, because like I said, glycogen resynthesis can take care of itself. Our next session is 24 hours away and we're consuming sufficient carbohydrates, with that caveat there. Having said all the above, I still recommend consuming your pre and post exercise meal relatively close to the training bout. This doesn't necessarily mean within a few minutes like most people suggest, but within a few hours post training, with the caveat you've consumed a pre-exercise meal 1 to 2 hours before training, and it's just worth taking advantage of any hypothetical benefit, even though we need to first of all look at the hierarchy of importance: total calories, macronutrients, and then timing is going to come way down the list if you're only training once a day. So hopefully I've blown a lot of myths in the importance of the post-exercise meal, how it isn't as important as most people make out within the context I've just given you. Within certain contexts it's much more important. For example, the trainee training twice a day within 8 hours, performing glycogen depleting training. So I hope you get this point. I know I've kind of rambled on, thrown lots of points at you, but hopefully you get the point. It's not as important most people make out. However, it's still worth covering bases, but you don't necessarily need to consume that post-workout meal immediately after training. You don't need to really spike insulin if you had a pre-exercise meal. It doesn't really matter if you have fat in your post-workout exercise meal if your next session's the following day. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Have a good day. Thank you very much.